You know how to hold it all together, but when it comes to your relationships, something's always missing. Welcome to Emotionally Wealthy, a podcast for high achievers who are ready to trade emotional disconnection for clarity, fulfillment, and relationships that are nourishing, not draining. I'm your host, Karen Conlon, licensed therapist, transformational coach, and your guide in turning insight into action. Are you ready for it? Let's do this. Welcome, everyone, once again to another episode of the Emotionally Wealthy podcast. I'm Karen Conlon, and today I want to start by asking you a very simple but maybe complex question. And that question is, what if the very traits that made you successful are the same ones that are quietly straining your relationships and just the way that you live your life overall? In this conversation today, we're going to explore how early messages about achievement and worth shape who we become long before we're aware of it. I'm also really excited to talk about what shifts when connection replaces control, and particularly in families that are navigating ADHD and really big emotions. Those are big emotions that often come with neurodivergence. So my guest today is Randy Free. Before becoming a psychiatric counselor, Randy built a successful career in engineering and consulting. So he understands achievement culture from the inside out. He understands metrics and expectations, and he also understands the cost of building identity around performance. Today, he works within one of the nation's largest managed healthcare organizations, and he's the creator of the Peaceful Parenting Process, a process that supports parenting of ADHD and neurodivergent children in moving from reactivity to connection. And all of this, everyone, while fulfilling his true calling that didn't happen until his late 50s. So this conversation today, everyone, is about outgrowing who you learn to be and stepping into who you actually are. I'm so glad you're here for it. Randy, welcome so much to Emotionally Wealthy. I'm so pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Karen. I'm excited to be here as well, and I'm looking forward to seeing where our conversation goes and supporting your following.
Oh, thank you so much. Randy, I know about your story. I know about some of the nuances and all of the things that you have gone through, been through to get to where you are today. But I would love to start with you telling us a little bit about who you were before you became the engineer and the accountant and parent guy that you are today. And I want to start by asking you, when you look back, can you tell us a little bit about those early messages that you absorbed about achievement, image, and masculinity, or even worth, and then how those things shaped and showed up in the relationships that you had before you came into deeper awareness?
Yeah, certainly, Karen. There's a lot there. We can go a lot of different places, but I grew up in small town Texas. My parents married very early. My mom was 16. My dad was 18 when they got married, and
Ooh,
neither of
very
them
young.
graduated high school. They
Hmm.
had me 2 years later, and then my sister 4 years after that. So I kind of joked that we grew up together.
Yeah.
We didn't have a lot of money, and mom and dad did the best they could to provide and to love us, but there was definitely a sense of performance for love, right? I think because they weren't high school graduates, they put a lot of
Yeah.
pressure on my sister and I to do well. Education was very important to them. They really wanted us to do well in high school and beyond. I also saw my dad as very masculine, but difficult to connect with emotionally. That
Mm.
created a lot of insecurities in me that drove me to achieve and try to prove my worth through accomplishments. And so that's where my desire to achieve began.
The first thing I think about is kids having kids, because you and I are both into brain science. We understand development. And one of the things that we know is that our brains, the part of our brains that controls impulse control and kind of the things that we need to truly be adulting as adults, that doesn't develop until around age 26, 27. So if you think about it in terms of development, and then thinking about your parents being so young, I can imagine how difficult that was for you and your sister, being little kids who, at the end of the day, children use emotions to communicate because they don't have the language.
Mhm.
They can't articulate what they feel. And so when you talk about your dad kind of having that masculine persona, which I'm sure he just took from whatever other patterns he saw growing up, it sounds like you learned very early on that trying to be emotional or allowing yourself to be your naturally emotional self was not going to work. I'm curious for you, if you think back, when you started to perform, right? Whatever performing meant, and, was it good grades or whatever it was, did you find that that protected you in some ways?
Yes, definitely. As I mentioned, my dad was very masculine. He was a mechanic. He worked on things. He could fix things.
Yeah.
He was into sports, but unfortunately, with us not connecting, I wasn't able to learn those things from him. So I felt always very insecure about that.
Yeah.
But as long as I could achieve academically, that would help quiet that voice that said, "You're not enough. You're not masculine enough. You're not man enough," because I could prove myself academically. And in some ways, I realized that it was the one area my dad hadn't achieved yet because
Yeah.
he hadn't graduated high school where I could excel. And and you think about it too, I was born in 62. The definition of men and masculinity was shifting. So it was coming from the stoic, quiet, master of the home to individuals who were shifting from putting duty first to putting self and duty together,
Yeah.
starting to be more emotional, more expressive. So even the cultural definition of what masculinity was starting to change.
Do you find that your dad ever leaned into that shift at all? I mean, were there times in your life that you felt like, oh, well, yeah, I see a little glimmer. I see a little glimpse here and try to connect. How did that go if you did have those moments?
Yeah, we have had them, and we are close now. He still lives in Texas. I live in California. I've lived in Singapore and Australia, so I've been out of his purview for a while. But we do talk usually every week or every couple of weeks, and I know he loves me. I know he validates me from that
Yeah.
perspective, and I think he's come to realize too that there are different expressions of what masculinity is, and
Yeah.
to be okay with that.
You mention expression, and it makes me think about how we express ourselves a lot of times through our identity. Based on what you're telling me, the reinforcement of if you do well, you perform well, this is going to get you some kind of positive reward, some recognition. I can see how maybe that started to become the identity, right? High performer, high achiever. And so I'm curious about when you maybe started to recognize that success started to become the identity that you presented to the world, an expression of emotion kind of took a back seat. I mean, I know it happened early on in the home, but did that spill over into other areas of your life?
Yeah, it certainly did. When I think of my life, I've had a lot of firsts, right? I was first to graduate high school in my family, first to graduate college, first to get a master's, first to move out of state, move out of country, to become a partner. So there's a lot of, big milestones there. Early though, in my 20s, that came crashing down when my first marriage ended in divorce. To me, that
Mm-hmm.
was a huge failure, and there was no mask big enough to hide that. It was out there for everyone to see. And it really caused a shift in mindset for me personally. It caused me to question of a lot about who I was at my core. And what I realized was that chasing achievement without a true sense of who I was in my inner self was just a treadmill that would never stop. So I realized, okay, I need to start. I didn't stop achieving, but I started achieving for myself and what was important to me.
What were you achieving, or who were you achieving for, rather, before that?
Yeah, before that, it was, my first wife, my parents, the
Right.
people in my purview that saw me, in my small town and the circle of friends that I had. I mentioned we grew up fairly poor. We moved from house to house to house, rental houses, and eventually into a mobile home. And most of the kids that I hung out with in high school were the ones taking the AP classes that I could get into, and I struggled, but they
Hmm.
lived in brick homes. So their parents worked at NASA, right? And so
Yeah.
I had struggled with that. I rarely would bring anyone to my home because I tried to keep that part, hidden. It wasn't part of the performance. And so I realized that when that, the divorce happened and things started crashing.
That's when you realized that you were doing things for other people.
Right.
Kind of a form of, I mean, it sounds like people pleasing, a lot of people pleasing going on.
Yeah. Some codependency, although I didn't know at that time what codependency was, but yeah.
As I think about what you're saying, and I think about the things that I have witnessed, experienced personally, and also with clients in the therapy space, one of the things that I see happening a lot is a reenactment. And there is a saying in the marriage counseling world that I've said before in and outside of this podcast, which is, we marry our unfinished business. And sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons. When you think back at that time, at their first marriage, are there any patterns that you maybe reenacted, even by choosing the person that you chose,
Right.
that were similar or reminded you of what you saw at home?
Yeah, when I think about that question, I realize I was definitely living into a strong provider role, and
Yeah.
the virtue of putting duty before self. I dropped out of college to work harder, to provide more material things, and I ended up losing myself.
Wow.
But I was doing that. I was sacrificing myself on the altar of what I thought was duty and love, but it ended up breaking me in a lot of ways.
First of all, it sounds exhausting.
It is, yeah.
I just am imagining Randy like just nonstop and looking to your wife at the time, being like, "What do you need now? What do you need now?" And I think that sometimes when that happens, the other person sometimes may not even be asking for more, but
Mhm.
you feel that you need to give more because on some level you don't feel worthy, or you don't feel like you're good enough or enough. And I don't mean to prescribe that to you, but I'm curious as to whether there was an element of that too, because sometimes when we're just in that go, 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 take care of whatever else is happening, sometimes we fail to see that the other person isn't even asking for
Yeah,
anything.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think the lived experience that I had, put me on that treadmill, right? That
Yeah.
performance was required for affirmation and for love, and, regardless of if the other person was really asking or expecting that so much, it was just what I thought was required to keep up and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think you have something there. It's not necessarily that the other person was asking for it, it's just what we're living into based on our experience.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is the fact that performance, a lot of times, becomes a form of protection. It doesn't feel that way, and it may not look that way, but within context, many times that's actually what's happening. Achievement, when we're looking at it from the lens of attachment, for anyone who's interested in attachment
Mhm.
theory and what that looks like, achievement also can become a form of attachment because it's a way that we use to try to connect with people, especially parents, right? Our caregivers that we desperately want and need that connection with. And if achievement is the only way that we feel that we're connecting, yeah, it becomes, like you said, like you getting on a treadmill, or I think about a hamster wheel that's just never ending,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
You don't see the end of it. So I know that you remarried later on, and I'd like to touch on that in a moment, but I'd like to know, in the meantime, while you are now maybe divorced, you get yourself back on track in terms of your education and things like that. Tell me what happened there. So what happened between the divorce and then the remarriage? Because there were a lot of changes,
Hmm.
both personally and professionally. So can you tell us a little bit more about what went on there during that time in your life?
Yeah, there's a lot to that as well. At that time, I had been going to college for electrical engineering, and I was working as a engineering technician with the local light company in Houston. And I ended up working there for about 7 years. When the marriage failed, there was so much debt. We had bought a small home, we had car debt,
Mm,
but I took most of that on, and so I dropped out of college. I got a second job. I worked that for a year to 2 years, paid off the debt, got my finances under control, and went back to college. I re-engaged, but so much time had passed, it became difficult to continue in the engineering degree. So at my junior year level, I switched over into accounting, and I
yeah.
ended up finishing my undergraduate in the business area, my majoring in accounting and becoming a CPA. It took me 9 years to get my undergraduate, but
Yeah, I was
in
going
that
to say it's
time,
a lot of schooling. There was a lot of
yes,
schooling going on.
yeah, I had a lot of higher math and science that, I no longer needed, but that drive to be educated was so important that it kept me at that, which I'm glad it did because
Hmm.
I enjoyed what I did. I went into public accounting, then went into industry for a while, and that took me to Singapore and Australia. Eventually, I made partner with a accounting firm in California, and that was a great milestone for me. As you mentioned, I did remarry. My wife and I have been married 39 years this coming May, and we have
Woo.
3 adult kids. So definitely got it right the second time around. But yeah, there were a lot of changes. I switched out of engineering, got into accounting, and pursued a different uh, degree and career.
So you go from this field, engineering, which is highly technical, very analytical, very from a lay person's perspective, the way I see it is 1 plus 1 must equal 2. There's no gray area. And there is, I think, a lot of control over the outcome.
Hmm.
There's a lot of certainty, because it either is going to work or it is not. Right. There's not a lot of needing to negotiate with people. And how do you feel about that? It is what it is. Right.
Mhm, mhm,
It's interesting because then I see you move to accounting, and accounting. Yes, there's still obviously numbers, and it's methodical in some ways, and also still very finite and certain. However, there's more flexibility. There are more opportunities to have discussions with
mhm,
your clients, other people that you're working with. And then you end up now working as a psychiatric counselor, which, I mean, Randy, all there is connection all the time.
mhm,
This is the pattern that I am seeing, is this very, maybe even unintentional, but absolutely on some level, maybe even necessary move towards the type of work or the type of environment that connects you with people.
mhm.
And I want to know if that was something that you ever thought about or that came to mind as you were moving. Like, was there any conscious thought about that as you were making these moves? Because it's very clear to me that you were very slowly moving into the Randy, like the Randy that you are truly.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's a great insight. You're right. I went into engineering and the like because I was good at math and science, and I thought, okay, performing in that way was the right way to go. I can, do very well and make good money. I
Yeah.
I could do it, but I found that I didn't really enjoy engineering. When I moved into accounting, I became a tax partner, but I did consulting.
Uh,
I thought initially I wanted to do financial planning and that sort of thing, but I ended up in international tax. And what I really liked about that was I loved to learn about companies and to creatively help them set up their international network to minimize their tax costs. So it was
Right.
listening deeply, putting together insights from the company to put together a plan for them. If you go way back to my childhood, I knew I was creative.
Mhm.
I was artistic. I loved art. And I remember, this is a sad story, but it was probably maybe fourth or fifth grade. I loved art class, and I would do these elaborate projects. But every time I'd go back, like, you'd leave them to dry or whatever, and set, and then the next day you were going to paint them. Many times they had been broken or
Hmm.
vandalized in some way, and so that happened repeatedly, and it told me, okay, this isn't an expression that's safe. And so I shut that part of me down, and I didn't pursue it. So I knew from a very early age that I had a creative side, but that it wasn't allowed to be expressed. And then as I became a young adult, I've always been interested in giving back and serving. So I began teaching Sunday school, for example, when I was 20 years old, and I've continued that process ever since. I've always been involved with youth and kids, and mentoring in that way, eventually starting a men's mentoring and coaching program. That was in my probably late 40s, early 50s, until as you said, could fully step into my calling, which was healing other people and helping to bring resolution to old trauma, and healing to their hurts, and make that
Yeah.
full transition. if you,
Yeah. Yeah, and that story that you shared about being creative and drawing and then making that connection between, oh, this is destroyed, this is not safe. I'm really glad that you brought that up because it very well highlights the point that children up to a certain age are very black and white thinkers. And I
Hmm,
think it's really important for parents to remember that they don't have the capacity to look at the gray areas. They don't have the emotional intelligence or maturity to say somebody, was being a jerk and did that. This has nothing to do with me.
hmm,
Kids have an amazing capacity to self blame,
hmm,
first
hmm,
of all, and say, oh, this must be my fault. I was behaving badly, or somebody must not like my thing or
hmm,
my work.
right.
And the other thing too is that, again, very black and white thinkers, children don't start to be able to think abstractly, if you will, until about, age, I think maybe 12 or so,
Hmm, hmm,
more or less. That's another, I think, important point that you brought up with that story. And I think a good reminder for not just any parent listening, but anyone who's going to be a parent and anyone who might have experienced thoughts like that during these really important and formative years as that was, right? Because look at what happened. You said, oh, this must not be safe, let me shut this part
hmm, hmm,
down. I want to maybe now go forward again to remarrying. One of the things that you and I had discussed before meeting here today was the fact that you did it really differently the second time around. There was friendship, there were shared values and emotional honesty. So I wanted to know from you, Randy, what kind of work? Was there work that you did on yourself? What were the things that you did that had you take a different path about choosing your partner the second time around?
hmm. Yeah, it was the first divorce was definitely a wake-up call, and that marriage actually, what if I'm honest, was part of the achievement. I married the leader of the high school drill team. This
Mm,
was a young lady who the football players went after, and I was not an athlete. And so
right.
for me to be able to date and then marry someone of that level, right, was part of the
Yeah.
achievement plan, until it wasn't, and it fell apart. So second time around, as I mentioned, I realized I needed more inner grounding. Through this whole time, I had remained in the church and strong in my faith, and really took a look at who I was and what I wanted and what it would mean to me to be with somebody. And so when my current wife and I first started dating, we used to go on what we called martini dates. And we would
Mhm.
we'd go to TGI Fridays and get a martini, and we would sit there for hours just talking. And we would talk about hopes and dreams and goals and really becoming good friends. And that was, I think, so important to understand at a foundational level that we were aligned. And I really hadn't taken that time in the beginning with the first marriage, unfortunately.
First of all, I love the fact that you name them martini dates. I love a good martini, and so that resonated with me right away. My husband and I have dates also, but I we don't name them. So now I'm kind of inspired
Yeah.
to give them a name. I love that, and I also love that you became friends. I mean, that's what was happening. It almost sounds like there was this friendship that was forming,
Mhm.
and at the same time, other feelings, more intimate, romantic, sexual attraction, all of these other things happening at the same time. And one of the things that I think about is the delayed gratification of it. And what I mean by that is the time that you both took to just sit there, right? Because it's very easy to, just get intimate very quickly. You're both adults, but the delayed gratification of all of that and just being able to sit there with each other and feel the feels of, wow, how do I feel with this person, not just during our conversation but afterwards,
Mhm.
right? And being able to just sit with that and take that in. I don't know, I think it's a beautiful thing to share and a wonderful thing to experience, because there's so much pressure
Mhm.
in being productive about everything, including relationships. Where's it going? Is it going anywhere? Where's it going? And so pressure can feel very productive until it starts
Mhm.
costing you connection.
Mhm. Mhm. Right.
And so this worked out beautifully. I'm curious about now your identity in this new relationship as a high achiever, because that identity, I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, it is it is a lifelong work. I mean, you get much better at it, but I'm constantly catching myself trying to pull back from perfectionism. That high performer, high achievement part of you, did that still show up in this second marriage, second time around? And if it did, how did you work around it?
Yeah, it definitely still shows up. I would say it still shows up today, and
Yeah. Yep.
as because as we got married, that's when I first moved to Singapore, and then as a family we moved to Australia, and then I became a partner, and I was
Yeah.
traveling a lot. So when I was in Australia, I would be gone, like every other week. I'd be gone a week, and my wife had two young kids, and then became
Mm,
pregnant with our third in a foreign country. So she was very tolerant, very self-sufficient, and able to stand on her own when I was gone and traveling. So she allowed me to kind of still be in that achievement role,
right.
but we were fulfilling our dreams. She wanted to live abroad as well. She wanted to travel and have new experiences. And so I think because we were aligned in that way, it worked. Uh,
Right.
there were times when it got in the way. I can tell you, I remember like when we would have family outings going to the beach, I would go crazy trying to plan it. I would make sure everybody had every condiment they wanted, the right kind of buns, and every toy, and the van was fully loaded. I would exhaust myself trying to produce this perfect family event to the point where I was ruining it for everybody. And my wife,
Right.
called that out. I was like, "Hey, you know what? You're stressing everyone out. Just let it be and don't be so perfect." And it took a little bit of time, to continue to step into that. So it definitely continued to show up.
But what would you say was the fear for you, Randy, when you think about those moments where, okay, because you're not at work, this
Mm.
is not a work situation, but it's still showing up, and just trying to plan a trip to the beach.
Mhm.
Right? What was the fear about what could go wrong? What was going on for you?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit. I'm not certain if it was a fear. If it was a fear, it might have been a fear of failure that would lead to rejection or disappointment. But it was
Mhm.
also just a drive to provide an experience that was exceptional. That
Yeah.
that drive to provide for my family uh, gives a lot of energy to that need to achieve. Um,
Yeah.
Even though, like you said, they're not asking for it. They don't care that there's, three kinds of pickles to choose from for the hamburger. They just want a burger. But in my mind, I'm like, oh, it's going to be a foodie experience, and yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I think that's the thing about high achievers and high achievers with overachiever tendencies. And there is a slight there is a difference between the two. With overachiever tendencies, that motivation is based in fear that something would go wrong, fear of rejection, fear of whatever it is for that particular person, and also a really big desire to control the outcome
Hmm.
so that we can avoid these bad feelings of,
Hmm.
like you said, disappointment or disappointing somebody. And so really putting it on yourself, even if nobody's asking you, to make everything an experience. I think a lot of people would absolutely connect with that feeling. Since you brought up the kiddos, tell me about your kids, if whatever you feel comfortable telling me about your kids. What was it like to become a parent who is a high performing parent in all sense of the word, and then you have children? If there's one thing that I know about high achievers and perfectionists that will knock all of that down, it is having kids. So I'm just curious what your experience was in having your kids.
Yeah, we have 3 adult children, adult kids now, and, my wife homeschooled them through middle school, high school. The older 2, have ADHD, and I always say ADHD can be a superpower, and fortunately, with my wife homeschooling, we were able to, address it that way, meaning she found what they were passionate about and
Yeah.
fostered that in the learning environment, and so we were able to do that. Somehow I was able to not, totally, lay on top of them my achievement desires. So I took the perspective it was okay for me to be that way, but I didn't need the kids to necessarily be that way, which I still not sure quite how I got to that, but, I'm glad that I did because I see that showing up in a lot of the families that I work with in my clinic where the parents' need to achieve is then placed onto the kids, and it does create disconnection because the
Mhm.
kids feel like they have to give up their hopes and dreams in order to try to achieve what the parent wants, and everybody ends up in conflict and frustration. It just doesn't work out very well. But with my own kids, we were able to foster what they were passionate about. And when I say ADHD is a superpower, if you know what you're passionate about, you can become very hyper focused and very, very good at it. And
Yeah.
so all 3 of them are doing well, thanks in large part to my wife and her mentoring and teaching.
Was it diagnosed early? By the way, I'm curious if it was.
Uh, with the daughter, probably 10, age 10 or so. So not
Okay.
too early, but a little earlier with the son, I would say. But,
Okay.
as you mentioned, when we were in Australia, we didn't have family around. And so she wasn't working, and she did fortunately have a lot of time to spend with the kids and to teach them and work with them.
Yes, and one might argue that you'd rather go to a 9 to 5 than be, you know, in at home, working at home, because that type of work is a lot of times so much harder than
Yes.
being that 9 to 5. And especially when you do have kiddos who have neurodivergent brains,
Mhm.
myself being one of them, and not knowing until much later in life, being diagnosed as an adult. It's very, very difficult to navigate those things where now I see them as a superpower. And before, it was very much kind of this stigma that I used to place on myself, saying,
Mhm.
what's wrong with me? Why do I think that way? Why can't I think like everybody else? it
Mhm.
was really it was really personally hard for me. I'm also curious about you, with being a parent to 2 ADHD kiddos. Was that difficult for you also? in terms of even disciplining and having your own experience, Randy, and also working with kids and parents. Is that something that you see also and that you experience personally?
Yeah, I would say I would definitely be a different parent knowing then what I know now.
Yeah.
We tend to parent how we were parented, and
Mhm.
being raised by baby boomers, it was authoritative or authoritarian, right? Do what I say, not as I do, and but there was no guidance. It was just do it. And
Yeah.
so with my kids, there was a little bit of that. I remember we used timeouts, which I wouldn't recommend timeouts at this point. And there were times when my kids told me I had anger management issues because I would get angry when they were misbehaving. And the issue becomes we typically focus on the behavior and we ask, how do we change this behavior? And now, when I work with parents, based on my experience in research and education, I try to shift them from the behavior focus because when you're focused on behavior, you get stuck in the correction mode.
Yeah.
And I want to shift them to, okay, not the behavior, but what's underneath it? What executive functioning skill is missing that I can then teach them and help them develop so that they can choose not to melt down or choose, better, healthier choices. So definitely a shift
Yeah.
in parenting that I didn't have when I was a parent myself.
I've heard you say before in talks and maybe even with me when we've talked in the past is that outbursts are not intentional responses, they are involuntary reactions. For the person listening out there where they're listening to this and like, well, wait a minute, and what do you mean outbursts are not intentional responses? Because when my kid is doing what he's doing, that sure looks intentional to me. I mean, they're really trying to piss me off here, right? I mean,
Oh.
I am guilty as charged. I have said it, many times, and then come back to my son and be like, okay, seriously,
Mhm.
she's
Mhm.
5.
Yeah.
So, can you talk to me a little bit more about that, that perspective
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
outbursts not being intentional responses?
Yeah, and you use the word perspective. That's actually the first pillar in peaceful parenting. Peace is the acronym. P is perspective. So I want parents to realize just what you're saying, that bad behavior is communication. It's not an intentional defiance. It's not a personal attack. It's not them trying to manipulate you. What's happening is in the ADHD brain, the gray matter gap between the logical and emotional brain is larger than it is in a neurotypical brain. So there's a bigger gap. And that means that it's harder for these children to access logic when emotion shows up. And
Mm,
a lot of people, when emotion shows up, then logic steps over and they're able to calm themselves. In ADHD brain, that bridge isn't built yet. And so the only way their brain knows to respond is with a meltdown, with any perceived threat. And a perceived threat can be simple as, I need you to stop playing on your iPad. It's time to eat. That's a perceived threat to them, and they immediately escalate. So there are some kids that are manipulative, but you can usually tell if they can turn it on and off,
uh,
then it's manipulation versus just a reaction that they have no control over. And so if your child is having difficulty accessing logic when they become dysregulated and you're focused on behavior, you're actually trying to get them to do something they can't do right now. So we need
yeah.
to look underneath and train the capacity for the skill.
I'm so glad that you made that point because not only are you bringing in the science and explaining that this is not just a behavioral thing, and actually it's not even sometimes it's not even a parenting thing, because I think sometimes parents are really hard on themselves. We self blame. Society, social media
Mm,
blames us and shames us, and I think it's really important to also understand and normalize the fact that, look, our brains also are different.
mhm,
If you take an fMRI of a kid's brain at age 3 who has been through trauma and neglect versus a kid who has not, there are changes. There are very clear structural changes differences rather in the brain. You will see a difference in the development and the sizes of their amygdala, which is the part of the brain that alerts us, and it's kind of like our alarm system.
Hmm.
So there's science, there's evidence, there's research behind this.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a really important point to share also, so that parents understand these things are not in vacuums or in silos, right?
Hmm.
We need to look at the whole thing together. And it sounds like your peaceful parenting process goes through those different areas.
Hmm.
Let me ask you also, because um, you mentioned the difference between the neurodivergent brain and the non-neurodivergent brain. Can there be a kid that is high functioning, but also not be able to regulate? Like, what's the difference? I used to work with adolescents exclusively before you moving to work with adults.
Hmm.
And I saw this. I saw some kids that were sort of high functioning in the sense that they didn't present in what we would expect for
Hmm.
a kid that is ADHD or that maybe is on the autism spectrum. But
Hmm.
then something would trigger them. Like you said, something as simple as, oh, it's time to turn the iPad off. And then there'd be the spiral, this lack of emotional regulation. Is that something that can happen where you have someone who's like a kiddo that is high functioning?
Yeah, I definitely see that in my practice. I can think of a couple of young men that I'm working with that are 6, 7 years old, and you can just tell they're highly intelligent. In fact, their coping mechanism is to read. They love reading. They would rather read a book than do anything else. But yet they can become very dysregulated to the point of becoming physical when there's transitions that they're not ready for or warned about. So that part of their brain is still developing.
Yeah, and to your point, it is a superpower.
Mm.
If we have and take the time to allow kids to tell us a little bit more about who they are,
Mhm.
I think it's a gift that parents give their kids, and also, quite honestly, to themselves, because a lot of times we're trying to control things,
Mm.
and it can look like parenting and it can look like leadership in many ways. But in reality, what we're creating is distance.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we end up creating disconnection when we're not listening to what who the child really is and what their strengths are, what their passions are. I've seen, unfortunately, mid to late teenagers come in who have been on that treadmill and they're trying to perform for mom and dad, but mom and dad just keep pushing and challenging. And like me and my creative side, they're squashing what they don't want to see, or they don't feel, as a parent, they don't feel as valuable. It's like, oh no, you shouldn't generate and develop your artistic skills because
Yeah.
you need to be a scientist or something. And the child ends up to a point where they might be suicidal, or they become highly aggressive toward mom or dad, and the police are being called out, and then there's 5150 holds happening, and a lot of conflict comes when there's that disconnect, and the parent is trying to coerce or force something that the child just isn't.
Randy, and for those of us out there that are not familiar with 5150 holds, what is that? If you can explain it
Yeah,
briefly.
so someone would be put on a 5150 hold when they're deemed to be a threat to themselves or to someone else. So, in one case that comes to mind, this young man was a threat to his father, and
Hmm.
so was put on a hold. And others, it's been they're a threat to themselves. They become so depressed in this achievement cycle that they'd rather just do something suicidal than to continue. So when we deem them to be a threat to themselves or others, they go into the hospital where they can get immediate care to de-escalate and give them skills to navigate coming back out to a lower level of care, which is usually talk therapy, or sometimes it's group therapy, depending on the severity.
Yeah. Well, let's talk for a moment then about the other side of that dysregulation. What happens when the parents are dysregulated? What happens when they've just reached the end of their rope? Uh, whatever is happening, and they're the ones that become dysregulated, what are they unintentionally communicating to their children
Mm.
about safety, about self-worth? What's your perspective on that when the flip side
Yeah.
happens?
Kids need to feel safe and connected in order to thrive and to learn. So when a parent is dysregulated to the point that they're becoming a threat, then that learning environment is disruptive. It also can teach the child that the way you get things in life is you become aggressive, you become physical, you become loud. And
Right.
that's not going to serve them well when they have relationships or they're in an employment situation and trying to achieve. So a really difficult message is being sent that to get something or to coerce somebody, you get loud, you get physical. So there's a lot of difficult messages that are being portrayed. We have mirror neurons, and the kids pick up on the energy of the parent at a very, very young age. And so, if the parent themselves are dysregulated, the mirror neurons in the child reflect that energy and they'll escalate. So, I always say,
Right.
if you as a parent escalate, you're giving your child permission to escalate. And then we end up in this cycle that is everyone's escalating and no one knows why.
Yeah, absolutely. Randy, I want to ask you, when you've experienced a parent shifting their lens and they're now approaching their relationships with their children, whether or not they have a neurodivergent brain or not. But let's say they've shifted their lens and their perspective to connecting rather than controlling,
Mhm.
emotionally connecting, leaning into curiosity. It's one of my favorite things to say because I just believe in it so much. What would you say happens? What shifts? What changes in that relationship when parents are able to change that lens?
Yeah, what we see happening is that it takes a little time, but the child begins to let their guard down and they don't see an angry parent as the enemy any longer. They start to see them as somebody who's actually showing up to help me. And so
Right.
they start to disclose and to divulge what's actually happening. And that's what the
Mm.
parent can then get underneath the emotions to find out how can I help them? What are they struggling with? And what skills do they need? So that kind of insight starts to happen that allows the parent to then focus on the real issue.
What you're saying is that, ironically, when they let go of trying to control in one area, they actually gain control in other ways.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very true. This morning I was with a group of moms and we were talking about the second pillar, the E in peace. The first E is ease. And I was saying to ease the tension in the home, you need to let go and of some power struggles. You need to choose your battles wisely
Yeah.
and delay or defer most of them. And they'll say, well, oh, well, that feels like giving up or giving in or being too permissive. And I
Yeah.
say, no, exactly. It's the opposite. You're actually being stronger and more strategic because
Right.
now you're focusing on which things you want to teach and to learn. And as your child manages those, and you can start to move in some of the other things. So that it becomes hard though to delay and defer if your ego gets hooked or you feel like, oh
Yeah.
no, they're being disrespectful, I can't let go of that. And you feel this pressure from society or others to start to fight all those battles. But fighting every battle causes chaos. And
Yeah.
I like to say, culling, choosing your battle creates calm. And when we're calm and coherent, then we can learn.
Randy, tell me a little bit more about your peaceful parenting process because we started with P perspective, and I'd like to just maybe briefly go over the other letters, what they mean,
Mhm.
so that whoever that person is out there listening and saying, "Hey, this is really resonating. I'd love to look into this framework a little bit more." Can you tell us a little bit more about what each of the letters mean and what that might look like?
Sure. So we've talked a bit about perspective. The P in peace is perspective. So helping the parent understand that this isn't intentional, it's not manipulation, but it's a deficit in their abilities or skills. So, first is shifting the parent's perspective, and that helps them show up in a more calm way. The E is for ease. We need to ease the tension in the homes. A lot of times when parents come to me, their homes are so chaotic, their marriages are starting to fail.
Yeah.
And really, it's a huge negative cycle that isn't sustainable. So I help them choose their battles in order to ease the tension. And then we go into A, which is attune, and that's helping the child learn to start to co-regulate with the mom or dad and then to self-regulate because they can't learn when kids are externalizing emotion, they can't internalize logic. So we want to change
Mm,
perspective, we want to ease the tension in the home, help the child learn to calm themselves, and then the C is connect. And it's not just connecting emotionally, but that's the basis of it, but connecting so that the child opens up and starts to share information where the parent gains insight into the cognitive deficit. What executive functioning skill do we want to focus on and help them achieve? And then we move into the E, which is empower. So with that information, now we can curate learning situations to teach these executive functioning skills. And as you mentioned earlier, the brain is plastic, and that means it does change. And so that's where hope comes because these are developmental issues for the most part, and we can work with our child to develop these executive functioning skills that are missing.
yeah, absolutely. What we're basically doing is through experiences, and that is why it's so important, not just to learn, but to practice. You can't do much if you don't practice because that's the way that the brain works and creates these new pathways
Mm.
that you actually get better outcomes
Right.
that way. Yeah, I really think that this peaceful parenting process is an amazing, and by the way, simple. This is the other thing I like about it. It's a simple thing. It's not overly complicated,
Hmm.
and it really just says, look, these are the steps. This is what it is, and you master each one little by little, one by one.
Hmm.
That's also something that people need, a framework like this where people can just lean into it, check in, and you apply to your own family. So, is this peaceful parenting process designed only for families with neurodivergent children, or can it be used by anyone?
No, I definitely think it can be used by all parents. It is especially effective, I think, with neurodivergent kids who don't respond well to the traditional behavior modification approaches.
Hmm.
And so it works for everybody, but it's especially effective with ADHD.
Let me ask this, Randy. What happens inside the family system, the family dynamics, when once again, because it does have to be parent led. Like, I mean, let's be real, it has to be led by the parents. So, in your experience, what happens inside the family system when parents do move from reaction based parenting to relational based parenting? What have you seen happen?
I think it fulfills our basic need, which is to be heard and understood at the child's level, right? The child
Mm,
has now a parent that is actually listening and hearing. And I coach my parents on reflective listening, right? That they can listen to their child and reflect back what they're hearing so that the child says, yeah, you get me, or no, you don't get me, and I can clarify. And at the end, the child feels really connected. And that is the basis of safety and the basis of opening up and sharing. And it's so important. I see so many parents that, and there are certain times when they're appropriate, but they'll sit down their kids at the restaurant with the headphones and the devices, and nobody's talking. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're not talking with them now, how do you expect them to talk with you when they're a teenager and the
oh,
stakes
yeah.
are much bigger? So connection is so important and foundational, but it goes beyond just connecting emotionally, but to really for the parent to understand what is my child struggling with and how can I coach them and mentor them.
And to your point about the device and stuff, I mean, obviously, yeah, the research is there. We're
Right.
not, we're not reinventing the wheel here when we say all this stuff. But I think what you're talking about and what I am also, I think, reiterating here is that these connections, the trust, the emotional safety, all of that gets created when they're little, when they're growing up.
Mm-hmm.
If you try to start that when they're a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
there might be some exceptions, but quite honestly, by then, the work is going to be a lot harder. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying that it will be a lot more difficult to establish yourself as a safety, emotionally safe figure, as a place of safety and as a place where they feel that they are protected and can come to you with anything. That
Mm-hmm.
has to start early.
Yes. And the sad thing is, if it's not you, it's going to be somebody else. It'll be
That's
somebody
right.
on the internet, or, that it doesn't have their best interests at heart. And that's where a lot of things go wrong very quickly.
Again, I have so many more questions that I could ask you, but I know that you've been incredibly generous with your time. So I think the next question I just want to ask you is, in closing, for those folks out there who are listening, they're recognizing themselves, they're recognizing their family systems, maybe their kiddo, some of the things you're saying now, all of a sudden, ooh, this clicks.
Mm.
This conversation is maybe the beginning of something for someone. And they're saying to themselves, you know what? I'd like to shift and just start going and doing something differently. But it's a lot. It can feel very overwhelming.
Mhm.
What would you say is one just small or gentle practice or place where you could recommend that they start with?
Mm. Just a simple practice I like to recommend to my patients, my families. It's built on connection, and if you're picking them up at school on the ride home, you're connecting with them. You're asking your child, "Give me one thing good that happened today, and one thing that wasn't so good," and just listen. Don't judge. Don't try to fix. Don't try to correct. But just listen to what they share with you and the emotion that they're experiencing, and reflect that back to them, and that will start to build that basis of connection with the parents. And it can be done in 5-10 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of time, but the child needs to feel safe. So the first time you ask them, if you haven't been doing this, they're going to say yes or no, or very
Yeah,
one word answers. But as you lean into it and they recognize, oh, they really do want to understand, they'll open up and share more.
I love that. And I used to call it roses and thorns. And
Yeah.
I didn't make that up, but I learned that from somebody else where it's a very well, what's the word? Non-confrontational, doesn't feel too invasive, and it's something that a little kiddo can understand. So, Randy, I have one last question for you.
Mm,
Because this is the Emotionally Wealthy podcast, of course, one question that I ask of all my guests is, how would you define emotional wealth?
mm. Yeah, I think emotional wealth, for me, is raising productive young adult children who are well adjusted and thriving, and that's always been my goal, my wife's goal, and I think that to me makes me feel emotionally wealthy if I can see my children doing well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Randy, where can people reach you? Because I just think people are going to want to learn more about your peaceful parenting process, where else people can go to look at your work or connect with you.
Certainly. My website is Coach to Resilience. So it's the word two, coach2resilience.com. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I do post usually weekly or every other week. So you can find me there as well.
Randy Free, everyone. Thank you so much, Randy, for being here and for sharing not just your personal and professional experience, but all of these wonderful insights. Thank you for bringing the science. I love it.
Mhm.
And once again, I hope you'll come back for more discussions.
Definitely. Thank you, Karen. It's been a pleasure. I love your questions. It really made me think about things and gave me some insights I had had before. So thank you.
Ah, Well, you are very welcome for that. And thank you all for showing up for yourselves, for listening to the Emotionally Wealthy podcast. If this episode gave you insight, clarity, or perspective that you needed today, or maybe you know someone who needs to hear it too, please go ahead and share it. And also, if you are enjoying the show, please leave a review because it will help. It actually does help to have the show go out into the universe and these conversations reach more people. And until next time, I invite you to stay curious, stay connected, and stay emotionally wealthy. See you next time. Oh, hey, quick reminder for you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always consult a qualified professional with any questions you might have.